Well, Connor, let's move on and talk about the Iran talks. And I think you have quite a few updates for us here as we hopefully at the end of this month, I think, will have some talks between Iran and the U.S., at least indirectly in Vienna. But that isn't guaranteed still. I think what November like 29th is the tentative date at this point. So, what are the chances that they actually sit down for those talks and just generally what's going on here, Connor?
All right, so yeah, the indirect negotiations are resuming on the 29th. We have Iran sending, well, their foreign minister is speaking. There's an article out here from antiwar.com called Iran Reaches Out to Nuclear Deal Participants Ahead of New Talks. Tehran is engaging with the remaining members of the deal, of course, Russia, China, France, Germany, and Britain. And their foreign minister has spoken by phone with his counterparts from each country. Hussein Amir Abdollahian actually told his French counterpart that they were very displeased by Biden's latest round of sanctions, which, as Dave said, came right after Iran said it was ready to resume talks. Since Iran, I should point out, since Iran has said that they were ready to return to negotiations, the indirect talks, after they've reviewed the last round of talks and done their analysis. The Americans, as I point out in my latest piece for the Institute, have responded by adding more sanctions. Blinken is threatening war on CBS Sunday. The Israelis are threatening war. The Americans are, instead of talking to the remaining members of the deal, going around. They're sending Robert Malley and reportedly an interagency delegation to Israel, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, who coincidentally, minus Saudi Arabia here, recently just finished military drills, their first joint military drills since the Abraham Accords were, the phony peace deals were made last year under Trump. With Bahrain. In this case, of course, we're talking about the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And it was obvious at the time that the strategy was to isolate Iran and to really encircle them with enemies armed to the teeth with U.S. weapons. A big part of the whole thing was if you throw the Palestinians under the bus and agree to basically be a part of this strategy with us and Israel, we'll sell you a bunch of weapons. So one of the things, of course, the United Emirates got was Reaper drones and thousands of munitions and F-35s. And now we have Bahrain, the UAE. They're in the Red Sea. These are let's see, they're doing it on a ship called the USS Portland, which is an amphibious transport dock ship. And the drills are focused on visit, board, search, and seizure tactics in a statement that was put out by the Navy's Fifth Fleet. And so this also comes just after Israel sent a representative to CENTCOM's headquarters in Florida, because, of course, now Israel is under the CENTCOM umbrella, where they previously were under Eurocom, but now since they've, in quotes, air quotes here, normalized with the Arab states, they are now also a part of CENTCOM. And so we're going to probably be seeing a lot more of these kinds of military provocations and drills. Speaking of...
And Connor, I
Oh,
just
go
want
ahead.
to take a quick second to highlight that particular drill that they were doing to board and search ships could be seen by Iran as maybe something particularly directed at them, as Israel has, interfered and sabotaged Iranian ships in the past, and also different country ships have been seized in the Persian Gulf. And so it's not like, they were conducting some kind of military drills that definitely weren't directed at Iran, where in this case it seems like they probably were.
Yeah, absolutely. The next time the U.S. seizes an Iranian tanker, they may do it with Israel and Bahrain and the U.S. Who knows? I mean, specifically the yeah, I neglected to mention that the drills are, I mean, obviously eyeing Iran, and the tactics sound like they're gaming out the next tanker they're going to
Right.
seize. The next Iranian ship. And of course, we know when we've discussed on this show, Israel has attacked more than a dozen ships in the last, I'd say probably year and a half or so, probably late in
Yep.
2019 through the early part of this year or so. And yeah, absolutely. So we may be seeing certainly them getting involved because they often steal tankers that are headed for Venezuela when Iran sells them oil in exchange for gold. Now, speaking of military drills, Iran says that they warned off some U.S. drones during military drills recently as well. So they were conducting what they called their Zulfiqar 1400 drills in the Strait of Hormuz, the northern tip of the Indian Ocean, and parts of the Red Sea. This was last week as well, and they say that they say that one MQ-9 Reaper drone and one RQ-4 Global Hawk. Quote, these aircraft, they intercepted these drones. Quote, these aircraft changed their route after approaching the borders of the Islamic Republic of Iran following the air defense's interception and decisive warning. Iran's state broadcaster IRIB said in a report on the incident. And of course, this is very dangerous. Dave provides context here talking about the drone that was shot down by Iran, the U.S. drone over the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran said violated their airspace at the time. And this nearly sparked off a war. You know, there's a great piece I'm fond of linking to in my articles on Iran where and we've discussed on the show previously, Gareth Porter wrote a thing for the Gray Zone talking about how really around that time, particularly Bolton and Pompeo were trying to provoke a war with Iran during the last sort of year or so of the Trump administration. And they were looking for a casus belli, and they had contingency plans all gamed out, including sending, I think, like 100,000 troops to the region. And they did try to use that as the casus belli. But as Dave says here, Trump reversed the decision and did not bomb Iran, even though there were plans to do so, to his credit. And so let's see. They also accused, speaking of seizing tankers, Iran recently said that they stopped the U.S. Navy from stealing one of their tankers. And then the U.S. said, actually, Iran was the only group one doing this any seizing. They claimed they were trying to seize a Vietnamese tanker. I haven't heard any confirmation on that, and that seems unlikely to me. What usually is happening is, as I said earlier, the U.S. Seizing, or in this case, apparently, or reportedly anyway, attempting to seize Iranian tankers. So in advance of the talks, Iran has put forward three what I would say are utterly reasonable conditions for the talks, especially after we've talked about. As Trita Parsi put out in that report recently, the Biden administration's negotiating team made it clear that Biden can't even guarantee sanctions relief or a commitment to the JCPOA during his term because he wants to use what they believe is their leverage, their Trump era sanctions to and the threat of reimposing those sanctions to gain concessions beyond the parameters of the JCPOA as it was written and implemented previously. Things like their ballistic missiles, their support for their allies in the region, and making the restrictions, making the deal longer and stronger, as they usually say. So Iran is saying they want the Americans to come out and say essentially that they take responsibility for leaving the deal in 2018, that they will. Let's see. They want to. Let's see. They also want the U.S. to remove all sanctions on Iran that were imposed after Trump left the agreement. There's still there's hundreds of sanctions that were really not lifted after Obama. So that's even a concession in and of itself. The sanctions relief was not substantive after even before the deal was. Before the Americans left the deal legally and reimpose sanctions. But they also want to make sure they want assurances that no other administration will do what Trump did in 2018 again. And so as I argue in my piece that the Americans should absolutely honor those conditions and we should insist that they do. Let's see. So there's also a great piece at Responsible Statecraft, which talks about the prospects what are called automatic benefits that Iran can expect, if secondary sanctions are lifted, if there is success here with these negotiations. And so I wanted to talk about it. Basically, she argues that really need to focus on the mechanisms that are and the verification mechanisms that are used to guarantee and verify sanctions relief. Uh, but she talks about the economic situation in Iran and what will be gained from lifting these secondary sections, these so-called automatic benefits. She spells out what they will be. So she talks about how according to tankertrackers.com, Iran is currently exporting about 1.2 million barrels of oil per day. Essentially, their only customer, or their main customer for crude, she says their only customer for crude is China. And in this year, from January to October, the price of oil per barrel has gone up from roughly $54 to $84. So, um, that's actually, as she says, has buoyed Iran's economy in the meantime. But overall, she says Iranian oil exports are still far below what they would like to see, which is 2.5 million barrels a day after sanctions are lifted, which, as she says, is a realistic target because the last time they received in 2016, rather, after sanctions were first, the deal was implemented at first. They went from an average of 1.6 million barrels per day in 2016 to, in 2017, they were exporting 2.3 million barrels per day. So, and she talks about how France and Spain and some of their traditional buyers for oil in Europe might be kind of slow to start importing Iranian oil right away, but the fact that China is already buying such a large volume. That means that on balance, their exports should grow at a similar pace to what I just described, and so she says at a minimum, so long as the negotiations don't break down, in which case she says China would reduce their imports, not cut them off, but reduce them. She says at a minimum they can expect in the first 12 months $20 billion of additional oil revenue. She talks about how they have currently a significant trade deficit that totals about $5.5 billion. In the first quarter of this year, exports were 55% of the same period in 2016, and exports were 72% of that same. Let's see, the volume Iranian exports, I should say, excuse me, were 55%, and imports were 72%. The imports are still closer to what they used to be because their import needs are more constant. They have to keep their economy running to the extent that they can. So they've been importing, although they've taken a big hit and they have this deficit. But after those sanctions are lifted, as they start to, regain, start to export, get back to a normal level of exports, that will help to stabilize their currency, which has obviously taken a major hit and lost much of its value under the sanctions. 62% of its value, she says, in the foreign exchange markets. So, and this has had knock-on exchange effects for inflation. She says as imported goods have become more expensive, but the sanctions would allow, lifting the sanctions would allow them to gain access to Iran's foreign exchange reserves, which are more than $120 billion. The IMF estimates that Iran currently has access to a quarter of those reserves. And that will also, as she says, reduce the prices of producer goods and imported manufacturing inputs, everything from food to advanced machinery, easing inflationary pressure. So that would also bring up real wages, as she discusses here. And she also says that real wages increased in the first quarter of 2016 after the deal was implemented by 11.6%. Than in the same period of the previous year. And then in the following year, they increased by another 8% in the first quarter of 2017. But right now, productivity is 24% higher than it was in the final quarter of 2015. So the next rise won't be of real wages. It won't be as impressive. But as she said, a rise of just 6% would significantly improve the lives of Iranian workers. So overall, if they do get this sanctions relief, it would, as she says, provide three primary benefits: a short-term incentive for Iran to comply with the commitments under the deal, which I can understand them being reluctant to do so anyway, because they have this sort of sword of Damocles hanging over their heads, as do any foreign companies that want to make investments in Iran, that at any moment the Americans could reimpose sanctions, and everybody would take a huge loss on that. And also Iran would have to cede all their leverage in terms of negotiating, which is their expanded civilian nuclear program, which they're allowed to do under the deal, as we've discussed before, Articles 26 and 36. But that's really what gives them, as I said, leverage in these talks and in their predicament, such as it is. So, but it would also establish, as she says, a foundation for the long-term work of implementing sanctions relief to facilitate major trade and investment deals, like the acquisition of civilian aircraft and foreign investment in oil and gas. And it would immediately boost Iran's economic resilience, providing a kind of, as she says, insurance policy for the Raisi administration. But what's interesting is, as we've talked about before, if they can at least get Biden to guarantee that he'll stay in the deal, although I think we've had Iran come out since then and said actually they're going back to their original demand, as I just said earlier, which is that they want to make sure that this does not happen again, not just under Biden. But even if, as she says, say the next Republican pulls out of the deal in 2025. Sanctions relief would have already provided Iran higher oil revenues, the trade surplus, a large trade surplus, a stable currency, and an increase in real wages, which would give Iran's government, companies, and households the opportunity to make long-delayed investments or replenish their savings, helping them prepare for the next economic crisis, whether it results from the reimposition of sanctions or otherwise. And yeah, so I thought that was very interesting. She says that essentially there's a group, it's called the Majlis Research Center, which is affiliated with the Iranian parliament, and they're one of several bodies, she says, which suggests that sanctions relief can be verified according to a checklist. This might be the verification mechanism they were referring to, in the previous months, where they essentially want to make targets, so they want to see as I said earlier, 2.5 million barrels per day in terms of their oil exports. But she says these targets represent economic outcomes that are only partly dependent on sanctions relief, and whether or not the P5+1 take a passive or active approach on lifting sanctions. So she suggests that the discussions about guaranteeing the relief should center on processes and mechanisms that provide such relief. If automatic benefits are a given, she says negotiators from the P5+1 and Iran should focus on interventions to normalize the relationship between the sides.
So I did really like that article, Connor. I did have one concern, and that was just with the timing of this. So there will be let's say they do it. There'll be 3 years left in the Biden administration, and so that will be maybe a amount of time to get some business deals done and stuff like that before there's a threat of sanctions. However, I think it's pretty clear at this point, and I think that most international analysis is going to say that Republicans will be back in charge, potentially significantly by the polling at least right now in November of 2021. Everything could change or whatever, but by the polling right now, maybe fairly significantly. And I think one of the things that was initially seen with the JCPOA was a lack of benefits for Iran, because something the U.S. was supposed to do is actually encourage other countries to do business with Iran, but rather the U.S. kept some sanctions on Iran, and basically the rhetoric coming out from the U.S., not necessarily at fault of the Obama administration, but from the Republican Congress and then the GOP hopefuls during the presidential campaign, was so anti-Iran deal that I think a lot of business didn't get done, because are you going to invest, millions, tens of millions of dollars in business dependent on the Iranian economy being open to your business and then it potentially being shut down? And I think that's going to remain a lingering problem for Iran here. Connor, what else do we have on this?
Sure. Well, I'll just say before we move on to other stuff on Iran, Tom Cotton led that letter as well that I believe they sent to Iran saying, hey, we're ripping this thing up as soon as we get a Republican in office.
Yep.
And even Rand Paul signed that, if I remember correctly. And so, it's unfortunate because they have to manufacture this enmity with Iran, but it doesn't really make all that sense all that much sense.
Well, it's
You know,
very similar to kind of the situation with either Ukraine or Belarus, where the war state manufactures these crises in order to have a crisis to throw money at, right? But then, if you keep throwing enough money at a crisis, whether it's at Iran or at Russia, the other country has to respond, even if your crises are manufactured, because your military buildup on those borders is something that feels threatening to those countries, especially, when you're talking about the US world empire being the country that's doing that. And so, almost like Russia, where there was no crisis to ever exist whatsoever, and we could walk backwards on it at any point in time and not actually damage any American interest whatsoever, we've now put ourselves in a position with Iran, with Russia, like we're doing with Taiwan and China, where they're inventing a war and manufacturing a crisis that they're actually somewhat turning into a real crisis in a way.
yeah, and it's interesting how people are able to just, kind of, not to be too uh, judgmental, but it's interesting that you could so easily get Democrats to sort of view these immigrants as like just this horde threatening Europe, when if they really did buy into what you were saying earlier about their position, Biden's ostensibly, he does, in practice, it doesn't really always work out this way, of course. But the idea is that they are welcoming people in, and we love immigrants and this sort of thing. But then the Democrats should be like, hey, send them over here. We're the
Right.
ones that started all the wars in their countries and get killed, their families, and made their countries into some version of hell on earth. We owe it to help them out a little bit, provide them some housing and maybe even a job or something. But of course it just that it's just, I guess they just got to follow the party line. So let's see. So the IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, has been complaining that Iran has not been talking to him. Essentially, he's saying there's an astonishing lack of how do you say it? Astonishing lack of contact. Now, what's interesting is he was there in Iran in September. He spoke with the new nuclear chief, but he still says, I haven't been contacted by the government. Now, what's interesting is Iran, I just saw a report from Jason Ditz on the Newswire at antiwar.com that they have, I believe, reopened, or at least there's a report in the Wall Street Journal. He said it hasn't been reported, but the Karaj site, which was attacked, of course, by Israel in June. And we covered this from the beginning, and what ended up being disclosed was that the attack actually damaged IAEA cameras. So they were, requesting more access. They want Iran, of course, the big sticking point with Grossi and the IAEA is that they want Iran to re-implement the additional protocol, which is essentially an aspect of the JCPOA that permits snap inspections, at a moment's notice from the IAEA. Now, they rescinded their voluntary compliance with the additional protocol after the Israelis murdered one of their top scientists, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, in November of last year with the MEK. And so Parliament demanded, actually, they wanted to kick the inspectors out of the country. But what Iran ended up doing was basically they had a monitoring agreement set up which was extended, but ultimately it expired when it appeared that negotiations weren't going anywhere with the Americans in these talks in Vienna, and they since have not restored an agreement to get more access so the monitoring data that the IAEA wants. Because they don't know really what's happening next in terms of the situation vis-a-vis America and the JCPOA. But in the meantime, the IAEA is making all this noise, for their own bureaucratic reasons, that Iran is, as Jason says here, they're complaining that the IAEA cannot access the site, which is now, as Jason says here, they're finally, at least the reports are saying that they're reopening to produce advanced centrifuges again. But of course, I believe the roof was damaged. They had to do a roof replacement at the industrial shed. It was hit reportedly by a drone by Israel in June, around the same time. Actually, I think that Israel had sent delegations to the United States to discuss Iran, sort of within days of each other anyway. And so the Iranians have for months demanded that the IAEA condemn this Israeli attack. And they've even said basically that, look, we'll give you access, but they destroyed your cameras. So can you at least condemn that? And they have not. So that's a pretty easy thing to do. I guess they don't want to make too big of a thing with Israel because maybe the subject of nuclear weapons and Israel being a clandestine nuclear weapons power might come up. But regardless, they don't want to call out Israel for attacking and damaging their Iran and damaging their equipment. So this is just kind of more controversy for controversy's sake for the IAEA and Rafael Grossi, although the Iranians have said that they have invited him. They said they haven't specified a date. They say we await his response. Saeed Khatibzadeh, the foreign ministry spokesman, said that he has been invited. So
And by the way, Connor, I'll just mention that that the IAEA had a change of leadership, I believe in early 2020 when Grossi actually took over for the former head, who I believe died of cancer. I think he was going to try to hold on for a couple more years and then he died. But since this guy took over, as predicted on the old Foreign Policy Focus show, the IAEA has been notably more hostile towards Iran. And so this was entirely predictable. Connor, any last stuff on Iran? We're over time here, so whatever we got.
Sure.
Yep.
I'll just say that essentially the Saudis are saying, even though they've said there have been reports that, in fact, that I cited in this latest piece, that they are willing to support the JCPOA if it prevents Iran from gaining nuclear weapons, which of course it does. Although now we have a report, the foreign minister is saying that he has strong reservations about the negotiations, citing Tehran's past deception about its nuclear activities. So it's a little ambiguous.
I don't know if you caught, I think it was the Saudi foreign minister said that he expected talks with Iran to continue,
Yes.
but kind of couched it in a way, I feel like, to sit on the fence to say, because he said that, oh, the talks were just exploratory and not substantial. And so I think the Saudis are very much trying to kind of keep their feet in both possibilities here. If the U.S. does get back involved in the deal, they want to be able to engage Iran in diplomacy. But if the U.S. goes the route of staying out of the deal, which I think the Saudis would prefer, then they want to remain with Israel and potentially, I think, probably normalize relations there.
And the last thing I'll say is that, Mali went to Israel and Yair Lapid goes, I don't think they want to join the deal. They're just stalling for time, which is interesting because they actually could be. Because like Trita Parsi said in his report, that they may choose to do that because it's more advantageous because of the risks involved in ceding all their leverage, only to be sanctioned and threatened with war if they refuse to, disarm, to get, to reduce their ballistic missiles or whatever America wants them to do with their ballistic missile program, which is, their primary deterrence or their support for their allies in the region. The Israelis are conducting drills currently in northern Israel, and we have Gantz saying that they're ready, essentially for war, and that if the world powers don't act, we are prepared to, and this kind of rhetoric. Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, wouldn't even meet with Robert Malley, saying essentially that he's promoting the JCPOA within Biden's administration and he doesn't support the deal. There was another source that said to Haaretz, another Israeli source, that said he's not even a senior enough official to meet with Naftali Bennett. So he did meet with the head of the Mossad and Benny Gantz, the defense minister.
But still, who's the superpower here?
Right.
If I'm Joe Biden and I send an official to Israel, the Israelis will meet with whoever I say my official will meet with. You know what? Like, how is that not his attitude? I mean, there are like little exceptions here and there on these kind of things that you can't control. But I'm pretty sure, you could tell the Israeli prime minister that they're going to meet with Robert Malley, who's not some scrub. I mean? It's not like some State Department official who got promoted or something like that. This is a guy who's been involved in Middle East diplomacy for well over a decade now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe this is payback for Biden falling asleep in the Oval Office when he
Or
was talking to Bennett.
or Mali
Come on,
being
man.
involved in negotiating the deal in the first place was kind of
For
my
sure.
thought. Was that's why the Israelis don't like him. But we should wrap up
Bennett
there,
likes meeting
Connor.
with Blinken, who's always throwing cold water on the idea of returning to the deal. And I think Blinken is likely very anti JCPOA, because if he was for it, I think we'd probably already be back in it.
Yeah.
Honestly,
I don't know. I feel like
he helped negotiate.
I feel like Bennett would have less issue meeting with Mali's assistant, Richard Nephew, than meeting with Mali. But anyways, Connor, let's wrap it up there.